Hey there, I'm Josh Pfriem, brewmaster and co-founder of Pfriem Family Brewers. I'm here today to give you a class on brewing international lagers and brewing with adjuncts and how those relate to making classical lagers. I've had a deep history of brewing with lagers throughout my career. Started my career back in the earlier 2000s, working at Squatters and Wasatch Brewery. Even back then, early craft beer days, made some great lager beer, and it was the beginning of my lager brewing. That was then taken to the next step when I helped Will and Mari Kemper get things going at Chucknut Brewery up in Bellingham, Washington. Will has been brewing lagers his whole career, and it was an awesome opportunity to be his head brewer and help him run production and get that brand, helping be part of making amazing lagers, and they still are today. That journey led me to Full Sail Brewing, where we also made a couple different lagers. Session brand was really big in those days. We were also contract brewing for Miller Coolers and helping out with some of their Henry Weinhardt's beers. And then when I opened up Pfriem in 2012, part of our focus was heavily on Belgian beer, heavily hopped forward beers, of all different realms, but then a keen focus on lager brewing. Never did I think that lagers and craft lagers would be at the point where they are today. Today at Pfriem Pilsner is our largest selling brand and is the flagship of the brewery. And lager production as a whole makes up for about, depending on the time of year, about 50% of our production and total production, and sometimes more. Here at Pfriem, we absolutely love lagers and love the nuance and the ability that you could do with them from a flavor standpoint to a drinkability, and they also work wonderful with food and a whole myriad of different occasions, and we are big fans. In the early days of Pfriem, we had a keen focus on brewing German lagers, which we still do, and a lot of the other lagers that come out of historical elements of Europe. In that, we started playing around with different raw materials, everything from trying to play with like rye, spelt, and different ingredients within lagers themselves. It was really around 2015. I was on a surf trip down in Mexico, and now I've been on this lager journey, brewing them for well over a decade. And I was sitting on the beach after surfing, crushing really fresh Modelo Especial, and I was like, man, there is really something to these beers. There's something to be longing for. There's a little bit more that could be there, but they're not too far off. This is a really, really enjoyable beer. It's well made. It has nice acidity. It hits this moment really, really great. Amazing with food. And it kind of put me into a tailspin coming back of like, man, why don't we make a Mexican lager? And at that time in craft, people weren't experimenting too much with different types of adjunct or international lagers. Might be a little offshoot here and there. You have like somebody that would call a Mexican lager like a burrito or something, and it would be made with who knows what from whatever different type of craft realm, which is great, and whatever inspires folks is always awesome. But I was like, man, what is the heritage and where did these beers come from? And it definitely made my brewer itch, and did a deep dive. And when I started learning about whether it's like a Mexican lager or a Japanese lager or a lot of these other different types of international lagers, most of them have a pretty rich heritage. At Pfriem, we love taking the approach of looking at the historical element, and then how does that historical element play over time, and then was there an interruption, or is it still something to build off of immediately, or was there an industrial interruption like there was with these international lagers where they had this like really craft or nuanced base, and then they were industrialized or changed over time. And so what I found out in this pursuit is that, in Mexico, early in their brewing history, they were importing in German brewmasters, and they were also importing in German brewing equipment. And then when the brewmasters got there to Mexico, they were looking at the raw ingredients and obviously importing some things in they could get in, but then they started working with local terroir. And in Mexico, it was corn, and it's a very similar story with like Japan and Japanese lager in Japan. That other ingredient was rice. You could look to early American brewing history, which was also heavily German influenced, and there was not great quality malt, and so they started using corn, which was in abundance and high quality. And so it was interesting that these adjuncts were kind of used out of necessity. These countries and these brewers weren't bound to German purity laws like their predecessors was, and so allowed them to dive into that. And then they started making these base beers that not only incorporated these raw ingredients, but like let the raw ingredients shine. And, in Japan, you have rice, which is more lean and bright, and you have sake. You have these really, really bright, crisp Japanese lagers. In Mexico, you have like a little more full, a little more sweet nuances, richness of corn that then, have also been backed by like Vienna malts and other like slightly caramelized malts, but then not a huge amount of bitterness there, but then are really, really cut with like pH and really make a round, gentle beer. And so we looked at this as a great challenge and opportunity. How do we take some of these historical elements of these beers and then look at them through a modern eye and a modern approach, and take a little more of a craft brewing approach that goes beyond what the current industrial setup may be? And so by that, what I mean is we are like, well, let's break these beers apart and see what elements that we can elevate. And we're talking, can we use the best malt? Can we use the best corn or the best rice? Can we then use really, really nice hops? Can we give these beers extra time? Can we use everything that we've learned from German lager brewing and classical lager brewing to elevate this realm of beers? And what we found is it's been this delightful experience that not only has the road gone further and deeper than we ever imagined, it has caused us to look around the world to find these for other brewing inspirations. And the more of these international lagers and different types that we've done, it's allowed us to dive in and make these beers even more nuanced and provide them throughout the year. And the journey has been incredible, and we're really excited to share that today and teach you a little bit of what we have learned to help you to make some great adjunct lagers and internationally inspired lagers as well. Before we get too deep into adjunct lager brewing and further information about the international style lagers, our baseline is our German-inspired lagers. So let's talk about the process there. There's a lot of things that are the baseline that really, really are important for us, and I think important for you to understand in order to make great beer. Because we need to be able to make great lager first before we can make great adjunct lager. And so we're gonna start through the malt handling process, then let's look at some of the brew house, hot side process, cellar process, and finishing, how it relates to our classic German lagers, and then we can touch on how that relates to the adjunct lagers. So the first thing, let's talk about raw materials. Baseline, from a malted barley perspective, we're using very high quality Pilsner. For us, we like to blend Pilsner. Just like rarely do you use just one hop in a really hop forward beers. All these beers are very malt focused, and rather than other major characteristics, the malt focus really, really allows us to take a deeper dive of what we can find out of individual types of Pilsner malt. In Pfriem Lager, for example, which is a very malt-focused beer, we have 3 different types of Pilsners. The backbone is Bayerman Pils. Gambrinus Pilsner gives us this really, really light touch. And then Canadian Malting Superior Pils, it gives it a little bit more depth. With the blend of these 3, we're using 3 high-quality different maltsters, and we're able to achieve a multiple different flavor profile that creates a depth. We love depth of flavor because these beers are gonna be very, very naked, and you're gonna be able to taste everything in them. And if you have poor malt or malt that you're not excited about any of the flavor, it's gonna show up in the beer. So always a good tip that is an easy one. As you're going through working for lagers as a whole, get into your raw ingredients. Make sure, eat the malt, taste it. Does it smell good? Because all these things are gonna carry through. And if the better job you do in your brew house, the more it's gonna make these flavors shine. So you wanna make sure you have the best platform to showcase on. Hop selection is also very, very important. Hops are gonna show up in a major way. We don't want them to be the loudest player or the biggest star, but we're gonna use them, and we want to draw some attention to them and attention to them appropriately. And so for us, with our German-inspired lagers, and most of our lagers here at Pfriem, we love the German varietals. There's something just amazing about the lower alpha acid, the softness, the grassiness, the floralness, the wildflower notes. And one of the things I have found that still strikes me and why we continue to use them is the general baseline for all these lager beers is malt is sweet, right? And so we want to balance the sweetness with something with maybe a little more earth tones, maybe a little more grass. We want dynamic flavor, right? If we're brewing a new school West Coast Pilsner, we're gonna let fruity hops from the Northwest, Southern Hemisphere hops. We're gonna let it rip and we're gonna have like a big party of a huge amount of flavors. But these more delicate beers, we want to showcase that malt sweetness, and then we want to have a certain degree of other flavors interacting. I'll get into that a little bit more within the individual beers themselves. Water, you gotta have great water. We are so fortunate here in Hood River, Oregon. We have some of the most pristine soft water in the world. It comes straight off the aquifers of Mount Hood. There's a lot that we could go into in water. That's probably a whole nother class in itself. But I think for the purpose today, know your water. Make sure that you are targeting certain types of minerality. We use brewing salts to adjust. We basically have a blank canvas, not probably a little bit more complex than what you'd find with RO water, but we are layering our salts and driving our water profile so that we make it follow through with the finished beer that we're trying to achieve. So I highly encourage you to have a good understanding, work with your water, treat it appropriately so that you have the right outcomes. Yeast. Yeast is lager friend. For all these beers, we actually don't jump around with a bunch of different strains. We love a variation of 3470. That's our house lager yeast. We have it fresh and vibrant across the brewery as we're brewing Pilsner or Pfriem lager a couple days a week in the brewing schedule. And so we have opted to use that for all of our international lagers as well. And that really lends us to healthy, viable yeast rather than trying to do nuancy, different yeast strains and having a different variable. There's all kinds of cool lager yeast strains out there that one can play with, and welcome to go out and give those a try. But for us, we want healthy, vibrant yeast with wonderful, clean fermentation to make the best results. And we layer in malt hops and other things and adjuncts to create a larger, more depth profile from that perspective. Within this, we talk about hot side of the brew house. We're very fortunate here at Pfriem. We have two different brew houses. We have a small one and a much larger 50-barrel, fully automated brew house from GEA that was made at the Hupton factory in Germany that makes incredible beer. And we have an amazing amount of control. And even our small brew house, we also have an incredible amount of control, a little bit more manually focused, but we're able to still achieve a lot of things we can with our larger brew house. Within that, we go to mash in these beers. We go through a step mash process. We like to go in and come in at 144 degrees Fahrenheit. We really like to have a 15-minute ramp to get from 144 degrees to 154 degrees to get our enzymatic conversion. Once we get to 154 degrees, we're going up to 174 degrees to stop the conversion, and then we're transferring to our lauter tun. We love that. That's our general approach. It works very well with our modernized malts that we get. We get a depth of flavor that is more exciting than a single infusion. That said, if you don't have the ability to do step mash, in previous years, early in Pfriem, we made great lagers using single infusion. So don't let that intimidate you. But also, if you have a way, if you have a smaller system and you can figure out, and you don't have a mash kettle, you have a way to put your grain into your wort kettle and play around with a step mash and see if you can get creative within your brew house. I think you'll be delighted in your reward, but don't let that stop you because you can still make great lager beer with single infusion mash. The lautering process is very important. We really like to have a very controlled lautering process. All of our malt handling is very gentle. We want to make sure it's really gentle coming into the mash tun. We want to make sure it's gentle into the lauter tun. We're very fortunate with our new brew house. It works with us very well to let us know if we can lauter faster or slower. All to say is use your tools that you have to make your lauter very nice, but also if you're working with more of a rustic brew house or if you're home brewing, just be really gentle on your lauter. Take time, don't force. We really want to get really clean, nice wort that is not full of a bunch of tannins and broken parts and off flavors. We want the best wort that we can possibly get. When we're talking about boiling is very important for these beers. You need to pay a little more attention to your boil compared to ale brewing. DMS will show up if you have DMS precursors in your malt or if you have a poor boil. We want a very vigorous boil. We have an external calandria that gets our wort very hot. We're at just above sea level. We boil at 218 degrees Fahrenheit to 222 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 minutes. And if we're working with a malt that we may think have a higher precursor to DMS, we will boil another 10 or 20 minutes longer to make sure we flash that off, even with using those high temperatures. So it's better to err on the conservative side. Make sure your boil is rolling and almost at a boil over point, or if you have a more automated system, make sure you're looking at your evaporation. Either way, that could be a great way if you're targeting between 6 and 8% evaporation rate, unless you have a system that's made for doing something different. That is a great way to know that you have gotten a really good boil. And it's a good way in general to know if you are consistently getting a good boil. And then you could always err on the little bit higher side, just to make sure that you stray away from any DMS. On the whirlpooling side, this is also very important, using whirlflock or other aids in the whirlpool to make sure that you're getting really, really bright wort. You've now just done a great job boiling your wort, and so you got great protein buildup, and you want that protein to fall out. So making sure that you're having good whirlpooling action, that your system's designed well, that you're actually getting the whirlpool that you think you're getting, and that you're getting the flock in the pile in the bottom of the whirlpool and that separation, so that you're putting the little amount of solids into your fermenter as possible. You want to be conscious of how fast you're going in to your fermenter. Faster, the better. We want cooling time to be fast. Once again, we're trying to avoid DMS in the whirlpool as well as in the kettle, but making sure that you're getting good cooling. In general, we like to go into the fermenter cool out of the heat exchanger for these beers. Average beer is going in about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of our other lagers, we may do 46 or 48 degrees, depending on what we're going for. But with 54, 70, that's a really nice starting point. But we make sure you get it and you get it in a short period of time. We really want to hit that residency time of the whirlpool in less than start to getting out of it. If you be done with that in an hour, that would behoove you in the long term of your beer flavor. Next up is pitching yeast. Talked about what type of yeast we like to use. I think really within lager brewing, you want really healthy yeast ready to go. For us, if we're bringing in a prop, we're starting small, we're giving the yeast time to grow up, and then really moving forward. So you're gonna have to work within your brewery to make sure that you're doing whatever you need to do to make sure you have great yeast. We have a great lab team. We know what we're doing with the beer to make sure that we have all eyes and can see what's happening. We like to pitch 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato, and this with very high viability sets up our yeast for success and gives us the flavors that we are looking for. Within that, aeration or oxygenation is also very important. We like to do 12 parts per million of aeration. We use oxygen. We are fortunate that we have an oxygen meter in line coming off of our brew house. So we are monitoring that we are getting 12 parts per million all the way through from start to finish, which also really helps us with that pitching rate to know that we're gonna get a really consistent and really nice fermentation time and time and time again. Making sure you have good glycol control in your fermenter is very, very important. You want to make sure that you don't have any big swings. You want it to be nice and steady. For a lot of these beers, we're running in at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we're fermenting them between 52 degrees and 54 degrees Fahrenheit. We like to have a slow ferment, and then they get down to 5.5 degrees Plato, and then we move them up to a diacetyl rest between 68 to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the beer. And then once we're about a degree to a degree and a half above the final target Plato for finishing gravity, we spoon the tank. We use barbecue devices, which allow us to regulate the last bit of off-gassing of the really nice CO2 and recapture it in the tank. And by doing this, if you catch us to do this well, you are able to almost 100% supply natural CO2 to your lager beer. And whatever you don't get out of the spooning valve or the barbecuer, you can easily get the rest by keeping CO2 pressure on the top of the fermenter. You can overcarbonate your beer if you're not careful, but if you're going in a long cold conditioning, you can achieve all your CO2 volumes in a natural way, which we also think is very, very beneficial to the beer. So after we go through fermentation, we've now seen our diacetyl rest and cleared and validated that we don't have VDK present in the beer. We've captured most of our CO2 through spooning, and fermentation is now complete. We like to lower the temperature down to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. We have it about 2 days there, and then we are harvesting yeast from the lager beer. And then after we are finished harvesting beer, We then remove the rest of the yeast, and now we are dropping the temperature down to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is an area where lager brewers can get a chance to play. There's some people that like to lager storage their beer for 6 or 8 weeks. There's other people that are 3 or 4 weeks. And I always hear a lot about time, but rarely people talk about temperature there, because the colder you go and the more you go down below freezing without freezing the beer, you shorten the amount of residency lager time you need. Some people may argue or debate this, which they like better. Some people like the beer between 35, 38 degrees, 34 degrees above freezing, and then cool stored for a longer period of time. At Pfriem, we like a little bit shorter residency time of about 4 weeks at 29 degrees Fahrenheit. I should say anywhere between 3 to 4 weeks, depending on after fermentation. And that allows us, we get really, really nice cellar maturation with that 29 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're every couple days, we are removing yeast off the bottom of the tank, because we would not want any autolysis that will show up in your beer at a later point. And that really, really cold conditioning really brings everything together, and it creates, not only you now have this really clean fermentation that is striking, and now you have this beautiful cellar flavor that's really round and the edges are knocked down. And these are really gonna be really, really important for adjunct brewing that we'll get into later, because the beer is so naked and you will taste those rough spots if you don't create an opportunity to clean them up. One thing I did not touch on that we'll touch on a little bit more is a couple things we want to happen there within the fermentation itself. One is pH. pH is going to be very important for all of these beers, from the classic German lagers to the adjunct beers. And for our classic German lagers, we're trying to get, for a finished beer, we are targeting between 4.45 to 4.48 pH in the final beer. And we're using brew house adjustment. We really like phosphoric acid, partially in the mash, and then a final adjustment in the kettle to achieve our final target pH. When we go into looking at adjunct lagers, we're looking at a lower pH. We really like these beers to finish anywhere from 4.1 pH all the way up to 4.3. And I'll get into that a little bit later, why that's important. A missing ingredient that some lager brewers talk about, if you do a lot of lager brewing, if you aren't talking about this, you are missing out, I think, on a very important ingredient, and that is sulfur. 3470 is a great sulfur producer. If you ever had a chance to go to Germany and drink some of the lovely beers over there, like, sulfur is a major part of the beer. When I talked about earlier about some of that sweetness that you get from the malt and the malt showcase, we're using hops to balance some of that sweetness, but we're also using sulfur. And sulfur should be looked at as an ingredient, and you should have a spec if you want more or less of it. So when we look at SO2, we measure it in grams per liter and in parts per billion. And so we are looking at how many parts we would like, and we actually have, just as similar as we have a target for IBUs, we have a target for sulfur. Our target for sulfur is lower in adjunct lagers than it is for our German-inspired lagers. And similar to IBUs, you can have a great lab and you can have data and you can look at all these things, which I think we look at them from a sense of as markers, and rather than we're trying to hit a specific target. We found those targets by flavor. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to assess these beers and how to make them better and have continuous improvement. But the key there is making sure you're looking at it from a flavor perspective. It's nice to be able to look at those numbers alongside your IBUs or your SO2 in your beer. And then from there, you're like, want higher and lower, and then to create a target. Those three things, they all affect each other. They're all gonna make your beer sharper, softer, bitter, more sweet. And so you move one, and the other one will probably need to move as well. So we'll need to remember that as we're talking about the full finishing of these beers. Next up, now we've had a great cellaring, we have the beer we want in the tank. It is now time to finish the beer. Finishing is a very important part of lager brewing. For us at Pfriem, we use a centrifuge for all our lager beers, and we are using that to polish off all the autolyzed yeast and then any leftover proteins. And then for most of these beers, we are then running through a lenticular filter. And the lenticular filter for us is really just brushing off any chill haze or any small particulates that are gonna show up in the beer with a little bit of time. From there, we have a way to bump up CO2 in line. Most of the time, our target has been met, but just in case anything was off or like we're a little bit low, we do have ability to put a little bit more CO2 in line, which we believe anytime that you're able to put CO2 into beer without disrupting the headspace, you're gonna keep more of your aromatic profile and your flavor within the beer. You're also not gonna scrub off any foam positives. Foam is a very, very important part of these beers, and we wanna do everything we can to keep the foam in the beer and not disrupt it at any point. For draft, we like these beers about 2.7 grams of CO2. 2.7 is great because we have found that's about as high as most modern draft systems can handle without any interruption. Even that we push, we're fine in our own taps here at Pfriem, but with outside accounts, sometimes 2.7 can be challenging, but that's that high point where we have really nice, vibrant, flavorful carbonation, beautiful foam, but we're not challenging people's draft systems too hard. In can packaging these, we will target closer to 2.85, which is actually very traditional in Germany. And that's partially because as you're pouring out of your container into your glass, you're going to lose a little bit of CO2. And we want that really, really vibrant, bubbly, bright, a little bit of that carbonic acid, and then that aromatic release that happens, because that is how you're gonna get your full sensory. And foam is beer and should be part of the experience. And all great lager should be really, really concentrated on foam. And I'm gonna talk to you a little bit later about some of the things we could do to help out with foam with adjunct brewing. Now we have ourselves a beautiful base that we can work off of to build international or adjunct lagers. Let's go ahead and now talk about adjuncts and what the different types are that you can brew with. I'm gonna break these off into two different realms. We'll talk about adjunct products and then actual more raw adjuncts that you're going to process in your brew house. At Pfriem, we've used both. When we were first getting into adjunct brewing, it seemed like a big step for us to get into serial cooking and do this big deep dive without even understanding how these new raw materials we're working with work within the brew house and the finished beer. And so there is a lot of great products available for you. From a corn side, like flaked maize can work very nice. From a rice side, any rice syrups or flaked rice dried syrup solids also can be very nice. The positive side with using these is that they're very easy. They're a simple put in a bag into the mash, compensating with extra water and going on brewing like usual. The downside is they are a product. They have been processed at a facility. They have a short shelf life. The flavors do not last as long in the beer as it ages. Great way to get started. Make sure you're only ordering enough of what you actually need for a lot of these things, because they do attract pests that you do not want in your malt house or wherever you store your malt. So get what you need, put it in the beer, and then move on. Reach out to your BSG or any supplier within the brewing industry, and they could give you a list of offering. Talk to your colleagues and your peers. People are definitely using a lot of these and with a good amount of success, and they're a good area to get started. As we have fallen in love with adjunct brewing and international lagers, it was just natural for us to take the deep dive into serial cooking and really understanding raw ingredients. It was actually a little bit bigger of a bite than we originally thought. When you go into this, be prepared for a large learning curve. You don't just go out and get corn. There's how do you want your corn milled? Do you want white corn? Do you want yellow corn? Do you want blue corn? And what type of flavors do you want from your corn? It's similar with rice. What grade rice do you want? How do you want it milled? Where is the rice from? Are any of these things going to actually build? Is the right size? Are you actually going to be able to lauter it, or are you going to stick your lauter ton? So do not just go out there and grab something off the shelf and try to brew with it. You might have the worst brew day of your life. Please make sure you are going after something specific. What we have found, this is a learning process for us. I would say in our age of working with these more raw adjuncts that we are processing, I think we are young and still have a lot to learn, and we will be trying different things as we move on and as we get more and more comfortable. But for corn right now, we really like a yellow corn. This is similar to what bourbon producers use. It has a really, really nice sweet flavor that tastes like corn, but you're avoiding flavors like tortilla or tortilla chips and you're not getting into some of the weird flavors that can happen with brewing with corn, of like mushroom or earthy. And so for us, this creates a really, really nice corn flavor that is harmonious with the malt flavor, because I'll get into that a little bit more about how when you're brewing with these, you can't just sub out this part malt for this much adjunct, and same IBUs, same pH, same sulfur as you use maybe for like a German lager beer that you're brewing. It's going to change the structure of your beer. And so you really want to be working with your malted barley to create a depth flavor profile, similar as you would build out with a hop bill. You're layering in hops. Certain hops are going to work better on your hot side. Certain hops are going to work better in the whirlpool. Certain hops are going to work better in your dry hop, and you're even at those, you're layering. So you want to think about working with adjuncts and your malt as layering flavor. And so within that, we like a polenta grit on the corn, and that allows us to process it really well in the brew house, which I'll get into in a moment. For rice, we have landed on a California medium grain, and that is milled to our specification. Both of these adjuncts, currently we're working with Adams Grain out of California. They've been incredibly helpful for us. Our supplier rep worked at Anheuser-Busch for almost his whole career and is an expert in adjuncts. That was his whole job at AB. He has been a wealth of knowledge for us. And so I really, really encourage you to look at, oil content, what flavor profiles you're trying to do. Are you trying to make something esoteric and want to use more like a blue corn, or if you're trying to make something more clean and use yellow corn? There's a lot of considerations you have with just your raw material selection. And then it comes down to quantity. I think adjuncts get a bad rep for a lot of reasons. One is that in industrial produced lager, they're used in very, very, very high quantity, 40%, up to 50% of the total grist. And then they're used in a way alongside of 6-row pale malt that is also has a very lack thereof of flavor. And so the whole design of the beer is to get great yield, great extract, but not a lot of flavor. So as craft brewers, we get our opportunity here to take our spin and our stab and do what we do with things. And so what we find is that by using these really, really high quality Pilsner malts alongside these really, really nice adjuncts, we have found that ratios in the 10 to 20%, up to 25% have worked really, really well with us. The flavors get a lot stronger and air towards the adjunct, over 25%. Obviously, you can play around with that, but for good starting points, these are really, really nice levels. And this is the same for if you're doing your own cereal cook or if you're adding in products. When we consider looking at historically how these adjuncts have been used, historically or with industrial lager brewing, they're used in large ratios, up to 50%, and then alongside of 6-row pale malt. And that lends a very mild flavor with high extract and low impact. For us, that is not our goal of these beers. Our goal is to express the adjunct and to make it work harmoniously within the lager beer itself, while taking this very beautiful, dynamic, lovely Pilsner malt, and then you're adding in this high quality adjunct, corn, rice, or whatever else you may choose to work with. And then we're creating a depth of flavor. What we also want to do is use hops to express this. And so one thing we find is you can definitely have fun, and there's no reason you can't use some of these techniques for like West Coast Pilsner, and where you're building a nice base and then you're making a huge hop experience. Absolutely wonderful for doing these type of things. Today we're talking a little bit more about nuance and how to use them from a nuanced way. And so what we have found that works really, really well is that we use a bittering charge of hops that is reflective of amount of IBUs that we want to get. And we're talking, for us, typically in that 18 to 23 IBUs. Once again, this is more about what type of flavor you're looking for than trying to hit a number, but that at least gives you a gauge to get started. And so we want enough bitterness there, and we will use a little bit of hop additions throughout the boil itself, but at very small amounts. We really really emphasize that first bittering charge in the boil, and then we actually really like whirlpool additions. It's really cool, even at a very low rate, and I'm talking about whirlpooling at about 0.2 to 0.3 pounds per barrel in the whirlpool, you're creating such a light, delicate base that these hops now really bump off of this malt and adjunct base, and that creates a flavor that you really get to direct. And our Pfriem Japanese lager, this is a huge component of this. We have a really delicate base beer. We're using Environment Pilsner malt with Canadian malting, Superior Pils, and then we're using the rice I spoke about earlier, that California medium grain rice, which allows this really nice soft body. You get some of those like light pear, light apple notes you would find in a fine sake. And then we use Saphir from Germany, which is very like spicy. It's got a little bit like lemongrass characteristic. And then what it does is it almost gives off some of more of these Japanese characteristics of things you would find in more like Japanese cuisine to give that experience without actually adding Japanese ingredients into the beer. And so these are like some of these really delicate ways that you can play off of these adjuncts. And in a different way, in our Pfriem Mexican lager, for example, our base Pilsner malt is Gambrinus, which is very clean, very soft. And then we use some historical elements. We really like Vienna malt in that beer. We'll use Vienna malt in a ratio of like between 10 to 15%. This gives just like a kiss of not as much caramel flavor, but a depth of flavor that goes really well with the corn. And so you now have this like depth of complex sweetness, and then we'll put in a little bit of Environment Cara Red, give it a touch of color, and give it a kiss of caramel note. And then what is very important for that beer is beyond the hops itself, the hops are just there to kind of like, hey, we're gonna keep the malt in check, we're gonna keep the corn in check here. pH is king. These beers are gonna finish at pH closer to 4.1 to 4.15. The pH itself is really gonna harness that sweetness and then really allow those other flavors to sing. You know, we're using some German Tettnang in the whirlpool as well, just to give it another layer of depth. And then for similar to Japanese lager and Mexican lager, we want our sulfur to be lower. Like we want it to be there, but we don't want it to be dominating. The beauty thing is with adjunct brewing, we see that naturally happen. The yeast does not produce as much sulfur when brewing with adjuncts. So you'll have to watch your kettle additions and your mash addition for your pH adjustment to manage it appropriately, but you will be rewarded if you are using the hops and the pH and that sulfur to then work harmoniously with the adjunct itself. When considering Pilsner malt, there's quite a variety out there, and we're very fortunate these days as brewers that we have choices from domestic varieties from here in North America to a whole slew coming out of Europe. And these are a sandbox to play in within all these beers. There's so much you can do to create different depths of flavor and to create different realms of flavor profiles. So it all comes down to what your goal is for the beer. One thing I always love about craft brewers and home brewers is that we get to take these things in any which way. I may see it a certain direction. I'm looking for something very light, clean, but impactful. Somebody may want something more full, more robust. Everything's on the table of what you can do for these, but it's all about having a goal. So for us, I've mentioned several different Pilsner malts we use. We have found there is no replacement for Environment Pilsner. It is a backbone to a lot of the lager beers we do here at Pfriem. We don't use it in every lager beer, but it offers something that we have found very few malts can. Part of it's the quality, part of it's the low nitrogen, part of it's the consistency, but having a backbone like Environment allows us to build flavor from other malts in. On the other side, Gambrinus Pilsner malt is a German-inspired malt made in British Columbia, but it is going to be much lighter. And on its own, can kind of go a little grassy, can go a little bit thin, but when you build it up alongside of more rich, more robust malt, it also adds a leanness to the beer that aids to drinkability. And then somewhere in the middle, we found that we really like Canadian Malting's Superior Pils. On its own, it's actually can go kind of biscuity, crackery. It creates a range of depth that leads towards grape nuts, and which we don't care for it when it goes that high. And so we're very careful about how much we use it. And it sits as a middle anchor spot to allow a depth of flavor that is complementary to whatever we're putting next to it. And then we take these into consideration as corn is going to come off a little bit more rich and sweet than, let's say, rice. And rice, you're going to have a little bit cleaner, leaner edge, and so it may need a little bit more malt depth and structure. When considering brewing with adjuncts, we must first look at what equipment we have available to do cereal cooking and to process them. So imagine most of you do not have a dedicated cereal cooker. If you do, you're set and you're probably already cereal cooking, and you probably can send me some information and some tips that you've learned over the years. I'd be happy to take them. But if you don't have a cereal cooker, let's look around your brew house and see what we have to work with. Easiest place to start, if you have a mash kettle. A mash kettle is a very sufficient device to be able to heat adjuncts. If you don't have that, maybe you have a kettle, your work kettle, and you are able to mash into that and modify it. If you're a home brewer, you might have one vessel that does all, and you might be able to figure out a way to make that work as well. Our process, I think, is very practical. And I think people get intimidated that you need to have this dedicated cereal cooker. You actually can use this process to have not only success with working with adjuncts, but also have really good downstream effects like excellent lautering, nice kettle performance, and then ultimately a great beer. But let's avoid a bad day by getting started well. Walking through how we do things at Pfriem, what we're doing is we're holding off on mashing. We are starting the production day with the adjunct itself. It's for you to choose how you get this into your vessel, whether it's your mash kettle or whatever you're using, but whatever you're using needs to be able to get close to a boil point with a solid mass. It needs to be able to get to close to a boil with using solids and water. So what we do is we start off with a base similar to you would do a foundation for a mash, and we're using 170 degree water, and then we are mixing in the adjunct on top of that. A really, really important part of this is that you need to be able to create enzymatic activity in your adjunct, and so you need to add some malted barley. For us, in our new brew house, that works out to be about 100 pounds of malted barley. You can play around with anywhere from like 3 to 6% of your total grist bill. We are now taking this malted barley and we are adding it in as we're essentially doughing in our adjunct. You need to have mixing going on so you don't get stuck. You're gonna be on the conservative side because this is gonna look more like polenta cooking or oatmeal or more of a porridge than typically your mash will, because you don't have a husk you're working with. And need good consistent mixing. And now once we're all the way doughed in, we are going to heat up to 208 degrees Fahrenheit. Once we're at 208 degrees Fahrenheit, we're still mixing, and then we are holding that there for 20 minutes. After that, our enzymatic conversion is complete, and we have the gelatization process accomplished. Now, we are going to mash in. For us at Pfriem, we use a wet mill. Our blending of water and malted barley is happening in the wet mill. We're able to target our temperature, so you're gonna have to adjust your target temperature however you mash in. For us, typically if we're brewing a lager, we're coming in to our mash kettle at 144 degrees, all mashed in. So what we're gonna do instead is we're gonna come in at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that's gonna do is that's gonna lower the temperature of our adjunct cereal, and we're gonna bring it down so that we have now a mashing in at 144 degrees Fahrenheit like we normally would do on a set mash process. If we've done everything correctly, we're at 144 degrees, all our malt, all our adjunct is in the mash kettle, and now we're simply going through our standard mashing conversion from our beta to alpha amylase, and we are doing that 144 up to 154, taking 15 minutes to ramp there, holding it there, and then going up to 174 degrees and transferring to the lauter tun. Now we've done everything correctly, we actually don't need any lautering aids. We don't need rice holes or any backup support. Might be good to have those on hand in case something got missed your first couple times around so that you don't get put in a situation with the stuck mash. But then we are lautering as normal. And for everything we talked about earlier about how to make great German classical lager, we're doing the same thing in the rest of the brew house. We're still trying to avoid DMS and all the same things that we talked about earlier. You also need to take in consideration when using adjunct products where you're going to appropriately put them with something like a rice syrup that easily goes into the kettle, but also making sure if you're on a direct fire or if you're using things that don't have a lot of movement, putting it in slow is always better, making sure nothing's gonna hit the bottom of your kettle and scorch. Really be in touch with your raw ingredients. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Make sure giving yourself an opportunity to make adjustments so you don't have a problem upstream of something that you've done with using the adjunct products. In regards to your cereal cook and gelatinizing your starch, it's very important to make sure you know what you did when you did it. So please make sure you're hitting these target times. Make sure you're using temperature probes, that you're watching your time, you're being very specific. These beers in general are very specific beers. The more that you're writing down, the more that you're paying attention to the very specific timing of how things are going, you'll be more happy with the results you get out of your brew house and within the final product. There are many details that are going to relate to how you mash and how you process your malt in your brew house that are going to contribute to the final outcome of the beer. If you're doing a single infusion mash and adding in these products compared to doing a step mash or decoction, all these different things are going to contribute to the outcome of your beer and to the final gravity. These are going to be hard for me to speak to directly today because you know your process and you know what you're looking for. The key thing is have a target of your final gravity and be familiar with a familiar beer that you're trying this out on. And some points, as we know with brewing, you got to get your boots wet and you got to give it a try. Give yourself some margin. Probably want to go out and brew your largest batch of beer that you've ever brewed as your first shot. Go small and work your way up with these things. And that's what we did. We found that before we even brought it over to our big brew house, we did several smaller batches with some trial and error. You're going to have trial and error, and there's no turnkey way to go about these. And you're going to find out, like if I do 15% corn adjuncts, cereal cook, and I do a step mash, it's going to affect my final gravity like this. The good news is if you're doing a step mash, right, you already have that process and you know the outcome. And so you're going to be within probably a couple tenths of where you think you're going to be, and it's going to work out just fine. One way to also play around and get more comfortable, less is more. You know, why not start off first time, do 5%, do 10%, work your way up. You don't have to go whole hog first time around. Give yourself an opportunity to fail a little bit and to trial and error, and then you find out what works within your brew house, or if you're doing a single infusion and you're layering this whole other new thing, you're going to give yourself an opportunity to make a couple mistakes without having to lose a batch of beer. I'm going to take a moment and get on my soapbox and talk about foam. Foam, we touched on earlier, but to me is a critical part of beer. All beers deserve foam, and all beer drinkers deserve the foam experience. How many beverages in this world, the ability to have a frothy, creamy, aromatic experience, ability to drink foam. Foam is one of the gifts we have as brewers. It gives us something to differentiate our beer, and it gives the beer drinker a lovely visual experience. It gives the beer drinker an aromatic experience. It gives the beer drinker a flavor experience. And really also, it's a moment in time. The foam is displaced for moments and then is gone and should be enjoyed. So we touched on earlier that we've done everything we can to preserve foam, handled our malt and our adjuncts well from dry and raw into hot side. We've been very gentle with our beer along the whole process. We've created mostly natural CO2 at this point. We have not let much of the CO2 escape within the process, including from a canning and kegging perspective. At Pfriem, Our kegging and canning is in a pressurized environment and does not allow those volatiles to escape. And we've done everything we can to not lose any foam positives, because once those foam positives are lost, they're gone forever, and we want them to be part of the drinking experience. With adjunct brewing, you're now working with less foam positives. The adjuncts themselves work against all these lovely things we do, so we want to help them out. Luckily, we're in the modern day and we have tools at our hand. Tetra is an amazing product. It is not only an incredible foam positive product made from hops, that it is also really, really nice flavor and a way to adjust your IBUs slightly. With these beers, we have really enjoyed, and we're still just getting into the nuance of taking them up to the next level with using Tetra. We want to use Tetra gently. Tetra itself comes with instructions, usage, and ratios, but an easy way to look at it is you only want to use it in a range that will increase your IBUs by 2 to 4. If you start getting to 5, 6 IBUs from your Tetra, you will start bringing in metallic flavors into your beer that will reduce some of the positives that you get from the foam. The foam impact, though, is incredible. It gives this lofty, tight, everlasting foam that has now displaced some of the adjunct material that you've used that is working against your foam. Now you have this delicate beer that you're able to express the nuance of the corn or rice or other adjunct in that flavor, but you're still able to have the aromatics and the foam that come off of it. And then also additional benefit from Tetra is it gives a really nice mouthfeel as well and adds another layer and dimension to your beer. Using Tetra, I think as brewers, also all ears, if anybody's figured out a better way to do it, we like to finish the beer with Tetra. We're simply creating a rig similar to maybe like you would use with Biofine. This rig can be either set up on the racking arm itself or in the transfer line. We've played around with both of putting it in through the racking arm while putting the beer in the bright tank, but we've also created a rig on the line coming off of the centrifuge into the bright tank itself. And then so we're getting the mixing and getting it homogeneous as we are finishing the beer and filling up the bright tank. There's many ways to do this, but that is one that has worked for us, but also let me know if you've tried something different and has worked better for you. Other hop products that we have found beneficial to our classic German beers as well as our adjunct lagers and international lagers is the use of CO2 hop products. Particularly, we've been using Flex with great success. Flex is a newer flowable hop product. One thing we like about it, rather than traditional CO2 extracts that you need to use in great quantity or they're a little bit more messy and you have to heat up, Flex is much more flowable, easier to use within hot side. You still need to be careful if it dries on your kettle or any part within the brew house itself. It does make a sticky mess and you need to be very proactive with it. But what we found is that it gives us a really nice, clean, consistent bittering characteristic that is very controllable. Once again, we talked about earlier, the balance between pH, sulfur, final gravity, and IBUs is very, very delicate balance. And what we have found, even with an automated brew house, really tight control on our supply chain with bittering hops, that the amount of noise that we get is enough to create a variance of 3 to 4 IBUs. And when you're making a beer that has 18 to 23 IBUs, that 3 to 4 now throws things off quite a bit. And now you're like trying to adjust your sulfur, you're trying to adjust your pH, your final gravity to this moving target. And it creates this almost unchaseable mess. With the CO2 extracts and the Flex, this tightens our range. We have a really nice, clean bitterness that we're able to layer in and build hops on and flavor at other parts of the hot side additions that have a little bit more control, that doesn't have to be as precise. And then it also gives us a really nice shelf stability. Once again, the beauty of these beers is they are very shelf stable. Adjuncts do hold up nicely in beer. And then if you could layer on some other very stable hop products, you also have a nice flavor profile that can hold up in a package over a period of time that gives it a lot further life. At Pfriem, quality control and knowing what we did when we did that and continuous improvement is our lifeline. We have a team here that wakes up every morning trying to make better beer than we did yesterday. This gives us life, it gives us pursuit, and it gives us happiness. We love making great beer and love even more to make it better. Our whole program here is revolved around continuous improvement. And how we do that is by having a team dedicated to quality. Quality is something I think most breweries talk about. If you're not focused on quality, you're probably not going to be making beer for much longer. In this community, we love quality and we love the advancement of beer and we love taking care of our beer drinker. We have a team here at Pfriem that works very, very hard together to make quality a top priority, and we have a cadence we do so. From our operational cadence, from our production cadence, to the QC cadence that touches it, and then we map in a sensory program, and then we use all that to loop week over week to make better beer. Some of the key things that you can translate to your brewery or your homebrew operation is make sure you have a cadence. At Pfriem, our week starts off very operationally focused. We're making sure we know what we're doing when we want to do it, or if there's changes that we need to make, we'll react to them early in the week so we're not making compromises. If you run out of a certain type of malt and you're having to sub in other kinds of malt, or a truck didn't show up, or a distributor PO is being changed so that you're changing your brew schedule, these things are ultimately going to affect the beer in the same way that cold storage and distribution and other things outside your control will have impact on your beer. You need to control those and have a plan for them to make sure that you're staying in control. On the internal side, we then have a series of meetings throughout the week. On Tuesdays, we have a meeting called PIs, it's process improvement. We are looking at all aspects of the brewery, looking at areas where we can improve. There's no area that is not touched in this process, and our team of managers is looking at to make sure that we're advancing each area of the production process. Next, on Wednesdays, we have a meeting called R&D. This is recipe and development, also could be called research and development. This is where we're taking a creative approach. We're looking at, from a recipe standpoint, where we can make improvements. Looking at raw materials, looking at hop contracts, looking at malt contracts. We're looking at innovation, collaborations, you name it, where soft touch points are being evaluated, and we're looking at previous notes from sensory, and we're actually making physical changes to the recipes. We went from process-oriented meeting the day before to more of a recipe and research side. This is also where we're trying out new hop products, new different types of hops, anything and everything that comes to the table. This is our opportunity to evaluate it as a management team and make actions. Thursdays are for package sensory. It's our management team comes together, looks at how our packaged beer is aging. We're taking detailed notes. We're looking at it from cold temperature, warm temperature, how it could be showed up if it was sitting on a warm shelf in some place that we didn't know about for a very long time, and figure out how to make that beer better. And we are looking then, taking notes that we're gonna now use in our previous meetings throughout the week. On Wednesday, we also have a meeting we call Den Sensory. We're right here in this room, and we're evaluating draft beers with our management team from a sensory perspective. This is where we're looking at, hey, we might have a new beer that we just came out, we're trying it for the first time, we're taking tasting notes on it, or we're drinking Pfriem Pilsner, Pfriem IPA, and we're tweaking and dialing in those nuances. We're like, a little bit of this, a little bit less of this. And these international lagers we just talked about, these are naked beers. These take a lot of attention because they're really, really fine tuning the very, very delicate nature. There's no big clunky thing to hide behind. If you're trying to hide behind a clunky thing with these, they're never gonna be what you want. And so this is our opportunity to make our nuanced changes, to catch them on the recipe sheet before we're brewed again, and then it's revolving again and again. Finally, on Fridays and throughout the week, we have, beyond management, we have panel sensory. This is great. We have people from the office staff, my business partners, people from the restaurant, from the packaging team, from the brewing team. We have a wide survey of folks that are trained panelists that are blindly tasting beers and giving us our feedback. So we take all these different sensory notes and then we roll them in to the PI and R&D meetings, and then we revolve them. And so week over week, we're making these subtle changes. I highly encourage you, if you want to continuously make better beer, you have to have a continuous improvement path to get there. You need to be always evaluating and tasting your beers. We can talk at a whole nother length of all the quality equipment and all the quality process points we have here at Pfriem. But if we're not tasting the beer and making our own sensory evaluation while evaluating all the technical data, there's no point in even doing that. We need to put all those things together, make the rubber meets the road. And whether you're a home brewer, small prep brewer, tasting room, or you're a large national brewer, you have to be intentional about these things and you have to build them into your culture and your team. And they have to be the heartbeat and the lifeline of your brewery if you want to keep making better beer. We are very proud of the beer we make here at Pfriem, and I think part of the reason that we get to make beers like these international lagers, that we can step up and feel we have quality of the biggest and the best breweries in the world, but also some of the flavor and the nuances of a craft brewery with a heart of gold, that we are able to do that because of this process that we have here, and the dedicated the team is to making these beers continuously better. Earlier, I spoke to the importance of foam and how that relates to the drinking experience. There's also other elements that are very important to the drinking experience of these beers. Another one is clarity. We touched on clarity earlier. Clarity is not an absolute must. You could play around and you could level the haze. For us, we want tight, bright, beautiful, sparkling beers, beaming with foam. We really prefer these to be in lovely glassware. Every great beer deserves a nice glass. Here at Pfriem, and we encourage all our accounts, we use very nice glassware. Some of it's individualized, but some of it is all of it is made for a great aromatic experience. All of it's incredibly clean. You have to have clean glassware. We do a pre-rinse of the glass before pouring. We're very specific to the temperature of our beers being poured. We make sure our keg coolers are between 39 to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, so that after the beer is coming out of the faucet and being poured, we're in the low 40-degree Fahrenheit. We audit that and check that regularly to make sure that we are actually achieving those results. And then we, on all our glassware, and I encourage all glassware to have this, we have a line that shows you where the beer should be poured to, and the rest of that glass should be foam. This all comes down to making a lovely beer drinking experience that allows you to have a beautiful visual experience with your beer. You see it coming, you have your bright foam, you have your clear beer, you have your wonderful glass. It's the right temperature. We have really, really nice CO2, so it's lifting into your nose. The foam and the CO2 is bouncing over your tongue and creating a lovely experience. And then the beer is drinking at the right temperature, and there's nothing interfering with the glass itself. And you're probably gonna drink a bigger drink than you would otherwise. And we want people, all beers at Pfriem, a goal, this is a goal, but especially for these beers, is we want you to be at the bottom of that glass before you know it and be like, I gotta have another one. We are not trying to make a beer that blows your mind away for first one or two sips and you're struggling to get through the end of it. We want that last sip to go down fast and looking for somebody to get you your next beer and then be thinking about your third beer. To us, that's drinking beer and its beauty, and it is what gets us up in the morning. And there's also other drinking experiences that are really, really important to us as well. I love mountain biking, I love snowboarding. The après, I always say, is my second favorite sport of the day. And in that moment, I spent my whole day, my whole week dedicated to getting to this moment. I'm out in the mountains with best friends, great company, just did this amazing thing. Why wouldn't I want to have the perfect beer and the perfect experience for that perfect moment? And I want to have one of these international lagers right then, cold, crisp, perfectly put together, and bring that moment to the next level. To me, that is après, and après happens the best with the best beer, and we are here to make that happen. I wanted to thank you all for joining me with this class day on brewing with adjuncts and creating international lagers. It's been great to talk to you about the nuance of how Pfriem does this. I highly encourage you to go out there, give it a try the Pfriem way, take your own take on it, explore this wonderful world of beers. Drop me a line, let me know how it goes, or come here to Hood River. We'd love to have you out right here on the beautiful waterfront, and would love to have an international lager with you or a bright, beaming, foamy pills. Until next time, cheers, friends.